For me, one of the most fundamental tensions of education, and one of the central questions of this unit, relates to what it is that forms the central matter of our business as teachers. If we explore the dominant messages we might find in the general discourse around education, in government policy, and sometimes in what teachers say, we find that one answer to this question might be that we're teachers of lessons, a perspective which emphasises the content of our teaching and the subjects we deliver, and one reinforced by the emphasis we find in schools on the central importance of the national curriculum. In this podcast though, and in those which follow in this series, I'd like to suggest that it's legitimate to break from this, and instead to suggest that we are teachers of children rather than of subjects. In making this suggestion, I don't wish to downplay the importance of the national curriculum, nor suggest that you don't have a statutory duty to deliver it. However, I'd argue that content is only one starting point in any planning and implementation process, and that we might equally begin with an understanding of the children themselves, working forward from that point in order to progress and develop them in ways that include the official outcomes of the curriculum. This sense of teaching beginning with the children is, I would argue, relevant and important in two ways. Firstly, it may well lead to a more effective learning, as it's based on a recognition of where children are coming from, rather than a focus on where they're going, and encourages us to build on what they already know and understand. Such a frame of reference also enables us to appreciate with a greater sensitivity the complexities which surround the ways children respond to the classroom. Secondly, I would argue that an education which begins with the uniqueness of the learner and progresses for an understanding of them makes for a more humane and humanising process. One that doesn't do this, which attempts only to push them through a series of external hoops, is inherently dehumanising. In this podcast, I intend to introduce the notion of identity to you as an important conceptual tool in the teacher's repertoire, and one which enables some sophisticated and useful understandings of what happens in our classrooms. The term identity refers to an individual's sense of themselves and their place in the world. In brief, then, we're concerned here with the question of me, the things that comprise my sense of self, the story I tell about myself and how I fit into the world, and the trajectory that story establishes in terms of my present capabilities and future aspirations. It's worth interrogating the notion of identity in more depth. In parallel with the sense of diversity presented to you in the last lead lecture, we might draw a division between surface and hidden components. Thus, my sense of self is partly to do with what I am and where I come from. That I'm male and white, for instance, that I'm from Manchester and so on. But my identity is more complicated than this. There are also more subtle and subjective senses to it. Thus, in the story people tell about themselves, different significances are attached to different components of self. That I am an educator, for instance, is really important to me. It leads to all sorts of values and commitments which fundamentally define who I am, both within and outside of my professional life. My gender and its significance isn't that important to my personal story, but it is for other people. In the context of the classroom, similar subjectivities are at play. Ethnicity, for some children, will be important, but not for others. There's a real tension here. Children's identities are fragile. Their self-narratives are still in draft. We must always be careful of writing onto them a sense of who they are, whether this is what they are, or the things that they should expect of themselves. There are also a whole range of features of identity which are not so obvious. They are more subtle and derived from that particular individual's experiences. My identity as an academic, for instance, is a product of the opportunities I've had and my encounters within them. For children, their status as a Manchester United fan or as someone who likes pirates or princesses or slugs and snails may well be important. We disregard, belittle or invalidate these aspects at our peril. One way of distinguishing identity, then, is in thinking of the objective sense of what people are and the more subjective notion of who they are. Another sense is in considering how identity is comprised of our similarities and differences from others. A basic human need is that of belonging, that we feel part of a group which values us and recognises our legitimacy. By extension, identity is about identification, and our sense of self relates to the groups to which we belong, our families, peers, neighbourhoods, friendship groups and social memberships, our classroom communities and the education system at large. I think it's worth exploring how we as teachers manage this sense of belonging in our classrooms, not just in terms of the inclusive culture of our groups, but also how we respond to the broader communities to which children belong. We need, then, a sense of belonging and similarity, but humans also have a fundamental need to feel unique and special. This sense of difference thus comprises another fundamental facet of identity, what allows children, and indeed all of us, to feel confident that we are in the world not just to fit in, but to stretch out with all that we can offer, that our talents and capacities and our quirks make the world a different place. All of these things, I would suggest, are important and vital for us as educators to recognise. A sense of who we are underpins much of what we do in the world and how we interact with it. It is then impossible to fully appreciate the behaviours of children, whether positive or negative, without reference to the kinds of senses of self which underpin them. These narratives too will impact on the kind of aspiration kids have, the confidences they have in their various capabilities, and ultimately what they achieve both in the moment of learning and in the broader experience of school. Attention to these details, to the sense of identity and how this affects children's experience and achievement, can be powerful, and can enable us to build practices which are both more responsive and ultimately more effective. So in this session, I want you to consider how the identities children bring to school might be of relevance. But I'd also like you to think about the reciprocal process. For what the children experience in school and from us as teachers has a significant impact on the shape and trajectory of those identities. We tell our class or a child within it that they have a bad reputation, or we suggest that they cannot accomplish something, and we act as an authority which destroys any aspiration to be otherwise. We create spaces to showcase how amazing they can be, whether those things that the curriculum directly values or those huge range of valuable things which it doesn't recognise, and we send them a very powerful message about who they are, what they can be, and what we think of them. More subtly, we respond to the identities that children bring to schools, and in doing so, validate or stigmatise aspects of their identity. Here too is an important process. Self-esteem hangs on the degree of prestige attached to what and who we are, to the groups to which we belong, and to our unique qualities. Where we value and celebrate those resources in school, then, we raise self-esteem. And we send important signals to children that we care about them and what they are, and that schools want them and are interested in what they have to offer. I'd like to finish then with an invitation for you to think more about all of these significances, and a quote which I think sums up the moral call that's being made here. It comes from the Israeli educationalist Haim Ginott, and it goes like this. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in my classroom. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture, or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humour, hurt or heal. In all situations, it's my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanised or dehumanised.